Text Talks.
Hi everyone, this is Dr. Brian Black from Lancaster University, and today's mini lecture for Text Talks is on Therevada Buddhism, particularly its textual sources. Okay, so as you might know by now, this lecture is supplemented by a series of PowerPoint slides. So looking at the second slide for this lecture is a map. And on this map, you can see where New Delhi is today. You can see an area called Kuru Panchala. And Kuru Panchala we might think of as this sort of Vedic heartland, the place where the oldest strata of Hinduism was really prominent. And then further along to the east, not that far from, say, where Varanasi is today, is an area that some scholars call Greater Magadha. And I think that it's important to see geographically that although Buddhism emerged in the Indian subcontinent and has a lot of similarities with Hinduism and other religions, that it actually emerged in a slightly different geographical area than where, say, the Vedas of Hinduism were prominent. Okay, looking at the next slide, I think it's helpful to think that there were a number of different religions that emerged in this Greater Magadha area. So in addition to Buddhism, we find there was a religion called Jainism. Jainism is a religion that still exists in India. And it's a little bit older, at least a half a generation or generation older than Buddhism, if not hundreds of years older than Buddhism. And as I said, Jainism still survives today in India. There are other religions like Ajivikaism. You probably haven't heard of that one because that died out probably 2,000 years ago or more. But if you read the early Buddhist sources, you'll see that the Ajivikas were just as much rivals as the Jains were. And so my point in bringing them up is just to remind us that Buddhism emerged in a context where there were a number of different religions. One major religion was a sort of early Hinduism that people call Brahmanism, but there were other religions such as Jainism and Ajivikaism. It's also interesting to think that there are a number of characteristic features amongst those religions, especially those religions that emerged in this Greater Magadha area. One is that they all had some sort of doctrine of karma, even though they explained that doctrine in slightly different ways. All of these religions had some sort of belief or understanding of rebirth. All of these religions had some sort of doctrine about the soul or the self. The Buddhists had one of the most extreme doctrines on this particular topic, the well-known doctrine that there is no self. But it's interesting that, this, what might seem as a rather radical position, can be understood better if we see that all the religions of the time had some sort of stance on this question about whether or not there's a self, and if there is a self, what the self is. Also, all of these religions had used the term dharma, and in a way that was quite central to their religion. And as we've seen in the Buddhist tradition, the word dharma tends to mean, or tends to refer to all the teachings of the Buddha. So, for example, if you ever hear anyone today say they're going to a Dharma talk, then that talk is basically a talk about the teachings of the Buddha. Another thing that these different religions have in common is that they're all non-theistic. So that doesn't mean that there aren't gods. There are lots of gods in Buddhism now, and there are a lot of gods in the earliest sources of Buddhism. However, one of the things we find is that gods don't tend to be nearly as central or as powerful in the Buddhist worldview as they would be in more theistic traditions. Then another thing that these religions focus on is renunciation and monasticism. So all of these are characteristic features of Buddhism, and ones that I think you'll be learning more about as you learn more about Buddhism. I just wanted to remind you with this slide, though, that these are features that you'll find across all the religions of ancient India. Okay, now I just want to say a little bit about the word Theravada and what that refers to. So the word itself means the way or the teaching of the elders, and it's considered to be the school of the elder monks. The Theravada school emerged out of the Stavira or Reformist school. It emerged after the Second Council of Buddhism. So in other words, it emerged probably within a few hundred years of the death of the Buddha. It's closely associated with King Ashoka. And according to Theravada sources, King Ashoka was not only a Buddhist, but he was a Theravada Buddhist. And he basically sent his son and daughter to Sri Lanka to start the Buddhist tradition there. Now, so Theravada refers to a particular school of Buddhism. It doesn't refer to all of early Buddhism because there were a lot of different schools of early Buddhism. So I think that sometimes we think of Theravada Buddhism basically just being the early Buddhism, but I think that we should remember that Theravada was just one of a number of different schools that were around in the first 100 years or so, or in the first 200 years or so after the death of the Buddha. And so we might ask ourselves, then why is the Theravada school so important? Why do we learn about that school rather than the other schools? And the biggest reason for that is because the Theravada sources have survived far better than the sources of other schools. So, for example, we have a number of texts from a school called the Sarvastivadin school, but we just don't have as many texts, and so we don't have as much information about them. And so a lot of what we know of from early Buddhism, we know through the Theravada sources, but we should just remember that they're not the only, that they weren't the only school around. Now, early Buddhism, not just Theravada, but early Buddhism is often described in negative ways by later Buddhist traditions, especially by Buddhists associated with the Mahayana tradition. So those Buddhists who were associated with Mahayana, the great vehicle, refer to all of Buddhism before Mahayana as Hinayana, which basically means the lesser or inferior way or vehicle. And so I think a number of things that it's important to remember is that there's nobody who would be a Theravadan Buddhist or a member of one of the earlier schools that would have liked that label. That is a derogatory term, and it's used by the Mahayana Buddhists to describe negatively all the early Buddhists. So even though it's important to know what that term means, it's probably not a term that we'll want to use to describe anybody from the Buddhist tradition ourselves. And also, it's important to remember that this term is not referring just to Theravada. So in other words, Hinayana and Theravada are not two words for the same thing. The Theravadan Buddhists would be included as part of the Hinayana from the point of view of a Mahayana Buddhist, even though the Theravadan Buddhist or somebody from a rival early school would not like that label. Another term that's sometimes used to refer to early Buddhism is Shravakayana, and here Shravaka means the hearer or disciple, and they are people who aspire to become arhats or enlightened ones, but ones who aspire to become arhats rather than bodhisattvas. Again, this term is not as derogatory, but it's still basically a derogatory term developed by Mahayana Buddhists to describe what went on before them. So I think that, hopefully this helps understand what Theravada refers to. In a nutshell, Theravada is, one of the earliest schools of Buddhism, and it's the school that whose sources have survived intact the most, and that's why we read their sources. Now, for the rest of the lecture today, I want to just talk you through what the main Theravada Buddhist sources are. One of the reasons that I think this is really important is that there's a lot of misinformation about Buddhism today. Most people who learn about Buddhism are only learning about it from their textbooks. And I think that even though we do need to be reading our textbooks, and the textbooks are important for us to gain an understanding, we have to remember the sources that our textbooks are using to come up with the information that they come up with. And one of the things that I've noticed when I've, in the last several years of visiting schools and looking at the GCSE and A-level syllabi, is how much, when it comes to learning other religions like Hinduism or even Christianity or Islam for that matter, there's a lot more attention paid to what the sources actually are. Now, these days, students are asked to use quotations and refer to textual sources or scripture when they're writing their answers for their examinations, but there's not, I think, nearly enough emphasis on exactly what those sources are and how those sources differ from each other. So that's what this lecture is mostly about. And in addition to that, what I hope this lecture will help students be able to do is to be able then to find things that they're looking for. So, for example, hopefully with the help of this lecture, if you think of this lecture as almost sort of a map of the Theravadan sources, hopefully now if you want to find a quotation about something related to karma, or if you want to find a quotation about something related to mindfulness, or if you want to find a story that says something about rebirth, that you can sort of follow this map and it gives you a good guide of where to look for the kind of material you're interested in. So most basically, the Theravadan school divides its text into three categories. Those categories are called the three baskets, and they include the Nikayas, the Vinaya, and the Abhidhamma, which in Sanskrit is referred to as the Abhidharma. And one of the things, now I've also listed some other Theravada sources. Actually, officially, all of these sources are also included within the Nikayas, but the relationship to the Nikayas is a bit less straightforward. So I've listed them separately: the Jatakas, the Dhammapada, the Theragatha, and the Therigatha in the Questions of King Milinda. And I'll explain what those sources are in more detail later in this lecture. Now, one of the characteristics of all Theravada Buddhist sources is that they were composed in a language called Pali. Now, Pali is a language that is part of the same language family as Sanskrit, and so there are a lot of words in Pali that are very similar to Sanskrit. So, for example, in Pali you get the word kama, whereas that same word in Sanskrit is karma. In Pali you get the word dhamma, whereas in Sanskrit that language is dharma. And so I think one of the things for students that's a little bit confusing about studying Buddhism from a textbook is it's not clear why sometimes the textbook uses the term kama and sometimes it uses the word karma. And the thing is that Buddhism operated actually in several languages. As I said, the Theravada school was just one of several schools that developed in the first few hundred years of the passing of the Buddha. And a lot of schools composed their texts in different languages at the time. So it wasn't like Pali was a particularly widespread or important language, but again, it's important to us because it's the Theravadan sources that have survived in their most complete state, and the language they used is Pali. And another thing to remember is that within the Theravada tradition, in all the early schools of Buddhism, the texts were composed and transmitted orally. Now that would change later in time. In fact, one of the things that most characterizes the development of Mahayana Buddhism is this shift from orally composed and transmitted texts to written texts. And that's something I'll talk about a bit more when we have our lecture on the Mahayana sources. Another thing that's interesting is to think of, when these texts were composed, and they were composed between about 500 and 200 BCE. Scholars debate about which text was composed when, but very generally the time frame that we're working with for all the texts that I'll be talking about in this lecture is that 300-year period between 500 and 200 BCE. And they were committed to writing at the Fourth Council in 29 BCE. So that means for the first 400 years or so of Buddhist sources, they were composed and transmitted orally. Okay, so let's talk in a little bit more detail now about what this first basket is, the Nikayas. The Nikayas are basically the sources that are known as suttas or sutras. These are the texts that contain stories about the Buddha delivering teachings. So all the main doctrines that you have learned about that are associated with Theravadan Buddhism appear in the Nikayas in one way or another. So, for example, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Three Marks of Existence, the Five Skandhas, dependent origination, all of these main doctrines that you need to learn about appear as teachings that the Buddha delivered in these stories. And now the thing is that most of these teachings actually appear in a number of different stories. So there's not just one story where you're going to find the Buddha talk about the Four Noble Truths. There's not just one story that you're going to, where the Buddha talks about the Eightfold Path or Five Skandhas. And one of the things I find that's really helpful is if you are able to locate a copy of one of these Nikaya collections. And I think that two of the most helpful collections are called the Digha Nikaya and the Majjhima Nikaya. If you're following me I'm on slide 6 now, so you can see in the top box are listed all the different Nikayas. And there are 5 different Nikayas. There's the Digha Nikaya, the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, the Anguttara Nikaya, and the Khuddaka Nikaya. And nobody knows exactly, why these Nikayas were separated into these groups. But the Digha Nikaya tends to contain the longest suttas. The Majjhima Nikaya contains the middle length suttas. The Samyutta Nikaya links together a number of stories thematically. And I'll say one more thing about the Khuddaka Nikaya, and that is more of a miscellaneous collection. And it's within the Khuddaka Nikaya that we see, for example, the Therevada and the Therevada that I mentioned on the previous slide. So all of these Nikayas are consisted of, especially the first 3 are consisting of basically short stories called sutras or suttas in Pali. All of these suttas began with the words, "Thus I have heard." They all mention the location of where the Buddha was and who he was teaching. And so if you can get a copy of the Digha Nikaya or Majjhima Nikaya, one of the things that can be really helpful is just look at the index in these copies for a teaching that you're interested in, and just look at the places where then the Buddha delivers that teaching. Okay, so to give you a slightly better sense of each of these Nikayas, I have a slide on each one. So let's start with the Digha Nikaya in slide 7. The Digha Nikaya has a number of different suttas. I think in the high 20s or low 30s. I forget the number off the top of my head. What I've done on this slide is I've just pulled out basically some of my favorites. Ones that are wonderful suttas with great stories, and ones where you can learn a lot about early Buddhism. One of my favorites is the Samanapala Sutta, and this is the one where the Buddha has a dialogue with a king, and within that dialogue, he gives an alternative teaching to his 6 rivals, and his rivals include the leader of Jainism and the leader of the Ajivakas. So in this sutta, you really get a sense of Buddhism as competing with other religions at the time. And you also get the sense of how important it was for the Buddha to make alignment with kings as he tried to secure his own foothold within this rather competitive world of emerging religious traditions in ancient India. The Ambata Sutta is a wonderful story about the Buddha where he defeats a young Brahmin in a debate and criticizes the status of Brahmins. And it's one of many suttas where we see that the Buddha kind of criticizes early Hinduism and criticizes the high status that Brahmins claim for themselves. The Kuttadanta Sutta, we find a criticism of Vedic sacrifice. Now, as far as suttas that might be particularly relevant to what you're studying, the Mahapadana Sutta is one that I mentioned in an earlier lecture when I was talking about the life of the Buddha. And this is the life story of Vipassi, who was a former Buddha in a former age. And so the Mahapadana Sutta is one of the oldest sources for the outline of the Buddha's life story. So if you're interested in learning more about the Buddha's life story, the Mahapadana Sutta is a great one to look at. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta is the story of the Buddha's final days, basically the last couple months in his life. And that is a sutta I also mentioned when I was talking about the life story of the Buddha. And the Mahasatipatthana Sutta is a great one to look at for some of the key teachings that you're asked to know about. This sutta talks about mindfulness. It talks about the five skandhas. It talks about the Four Noble Truths. And it talks about the Eightfold Path. The Majjhima Nikaya also has a number of really fun suttas to look at. One of the things I picked out are those suttas that are particularly about things like karma and rebirth, or meditation, or mindfulness. I'm on slide 8 now. One that's a great story to read is the Angulimala Sutta, which is this famous story about the Buddha converting a notorious criminal. There's also the Chula Malunkya Sutta that contains that famous analogy of a man shot by an arrow. And this analogy is a great way to sort of learn about how the Buddha presents his teachings as a middle way. So I'd certainly encourage you to look at some of these suttas as you're trying to engage more within the primary sources. I don't have as much to say about the Samyutta Nikaya, except that, again, I've listed just a few suttas that contain teachings that might be related to ones that you want to find sources about. It's worth saying that the Anguttara Nikaya contains this famous story about Kisha Gotami and the parable of the mustard seed. So if you've heard about the mustard seed parable or you want to learn more about it, this is the source of where you can find it. Now I just want to say a few things about the Vinaya. So whereas the Nikayas contain the suttas, and the suttas are basically stories where the Buddha gives teachings, the Vinaya contains stories about the Buddha where the Buddha gives rules about how monks and nuns should live their lives in the monastic community. According to some scholars, this contains some of the oldest sections of the Pali Canon. Another thing that's kind of interesting to think about is that whereas the Nikayas, or the content in the suttas, seem to have a quite wide variety from school to school, as different Buddhist schools had slightly different understandings of the Buddha's teaching, the Vinaya remained a lot more uniform. So, in other words, the early Buddhist schools seem to argue a lot less about the rules of monks and nuns than the teachings themselves. In the Mahavagga, which is a section of the Khandaka, which is the second section of the Vinaya, we find another reference to the life story of the Buddha that outlines his enlightenment in his first two sermons. So, if you're interested in looking for more kind of textual evidence of the Buddha's life story, that's another place to be looking. Now, one of the things that's another issue that's particularly interesting about the Vinaya is that it contains the story of Mahaprajapati, and Mahaprajapati was the Buddha's aunt, and she was also the founder of the order of nuns within the Buddhist tradition. She was the first ordained nun and the first female teacher of Buddhism, at least according to this story. Now, one of the things you might have learned about is that the Buddha's own position about whether or not women should be nuns and whether women should be sort of part of the monastic tradition of Buddhism was not straightforward. And I think one of the things this story really shows are some of the tensions, where on the one hand, he did allow an order of nuns, but on the other hand, he seemed to have reservations about that. Okay, I've also included in the slides a slide about the Abhidhamma. The Abhidhamma, we might say, was like really the beginnings of Buddhist philosophy. And the Abhidhamma is basically consisting of texts that are about the Buddha's teachings, but without the stories. But I would say that as far as GCSE and A-level students, you're probably not going to get much out of the Abhidhamma. So I just thought it was probably important for you to know what these texts were in case you came across a mention of them somewhere in the textbooks. But on the other hand, I think that when you're preparing for teaching Buddhism or when you're preparing for taking exams on Buddhism at GCSE and A-level, you're much better off going to the suttas and the Vinaya. But another group of texts that you might be interested in that are highly engaging are the texts called the Jatakas. And on the one hand, the Jatakas are formally connected to the Khuddaka Nikaya. But on the other hand, I think that we might see as the Jatakas as just their own set of texts. And these are the stories about the Buddha's previous lives. And within the Jatakas of the Theravadan school, there are 547 stories in 22 books. And the key themes are karma, rebirth, and royal renunciation. I think that if you're looking to, for Buddhist literature that's engaging and that really brings some of the teachings to life, the Jatakas are a wonderful place to explore. Again, I've just listed a number of Jatakas that, that are particularly engaging and popular. I'm not going to go through them here, but I'd certainly recommend you to explore some Jataka stories yourselves. And one thing I think that's also important to remember is that for most Buddhists today in Theravadan countries, they're much more likely to be familiar with the Jataka stories than the stories in the Nikayas. And another thing that's interesting along those lines is that the stories that are depicted in the murals of the ancient monastic sites that still exist from ancient India tend to depict stories from the Jatakas. So even though the Nikayas are really important for understanding some of the details of some of the teachings, we might see the Jatakas as always more popular with the wider community. Now, another text that is worth looking at, and this one is also associated officially with the Khuddaka Nikaya, is the Dhammapada. And the Dhammapada, is sometimes compared with the Bhagavad Gita as being this sort of source text of Buddhism. As far as I know, the Dhammapada doesn't really have any sort of higher status within the Buddhist tradition than any of the other texts that we're talking about. But it is a good text to look at when you're reviewing for your exams, because it contains a number of the references to some of the core teachings. And it's certainly one of the most read and quoted Buddhist texts within the modern era. Some of the themes are giving ethical advice, the transience of life, and how much the sense organs delude us. Now, there's been a fine translation recently by Valerie Roebuck that you might want to look at. But yeah, I think that whether you look at the Dhammapada or not has a lot to do with the kind of material that you're most likely to engage with. For myself, I find myself much better to understand some of the Buddhist teaching through the stories. So I tend to go to the Nikayas to look at the kind of context where the Buddha might, who does he teach the Four Noble Truths to? What did those people learn from it? What is the relationship between the story and the teaching? The Dhammapada, on the other hand, doesn't have stories, but rather a collection of verses. And so, in a sense, it has, in a more sort of distilled form, some of the major teaching, but also with less sort of narrative context. Now, another widely translated and widely known text from early Buddhism is one that's called The Questions of King Milinda. And it is quite a long text, a dialogue between the monk Nagasena and King Milinda. And one of the great things about this text is it really goes into a lot of detail about a number of the Buddha's core teaching. So if you can find the Buddha talking about not self, you can find the Buddha talking about the five khandhas. You can, find the Buddha between the monk Nagasena talking about the not self, the five khandhas, nibbana. And also we have this famous metaphor in the Questions of King Milinda about the chariot. And one of the things that's interesting about this metaphor is it seems to be sort of riffing off a metaphor that we find in the Hindu Upanishads, where it uses a metaphor of the chariot to teach a doctrine about the self. Here, Nagasena teaches King Milinda about not self, but again uses the metaphor of a chariot to do so. So if you want to find a Buddhist source that talks quite a bit about a lot of the key teachings that you're being asked to learn more about, the Questions of King Milinda is also a great source to be looking at. Now, one more source that I just want to point out, and this is one of my very favorite ones, and this is the Therevada. Again, this is officially part of the Khuddaka Nikaya, but it's very much its own text. And the Therevada is a collection of verses composed by nuns. We're not exactly sure when it was composed, but a lot of scholars think that this is one of the older texts within the Theravadan tradition. And in fact, it's the earliest known collection of women's literature in the world. So even just beyond our interest in Buddhism, our interest in women's literature, in women and religion, this is a very important text. And one of the things that I think is so exciting about this text is that it really talks about early Buddhism from the perspective of some of its first female followers. And so even though it talks about some of the themes that we would be that we would find in other stories, like themes like, you know, what it's like to renounce, some of the reasons why somebody in the monastic community renounced in the first place, we find that when women are reflecting on the teachings of the Buddha, they reflect upon them in relation to their own experiences. And those experiences are often quite different ones. And so, you know, we have this wonderful, poem here that I have on slide 16, when this recently converted nun says, "So freed, so thoroughly freed am I from three crooked things, from the mortar, the pestle, and the crooked husband. Having uprooted the craving that leads to becoming, I'm set free from aging and death." And so here we see that, you know, for a lot of early women who converted to Buddhism, it wasn't just understanding, you know, the truths of the Buddhist teachings, but also, you know, they were escaping a life of servitude and perhaps mistreatment, and the Buddhist community had, you know, things to offer them because of their very specific situation in life. I definitely recommend all of you to take a look at the Therevada. Okay, so this is sort of like a whistle-stop tour through some of the main Buddhist sources, and in addition to the slides that I have on each one of these sources to give you kind of an idea of what they're about, I've also included 4 slides at the end listing some of the translations, and wherever possible, I've tried to list translations that are available online, and I've even, pulled out, episodes like the mustard seed, so you could just go straight to that episode. I've also listed some helpful websites and some further reading. I know that, the early Buddhism has a lot of texts. It would take you literally years to read every page of all of these texts, and I'm certainly not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that we can learn so much more about early Buddhism when we go beyond the textbooks and look at those sources that were composed by Buddhists themselves when Buddhism was still an emerging religion. We can get a much better understanding of the teaching when we see them in their narrative context. We see who teaches these teachings, who these teachings are taught to, and how people within the stories are transformed by them. So I can't emphasize enough what a engaging and wonderful journey it is to engage directly with the Buddhist sources. Hopefully this lecture will give you a sort of map of how to get started. Thank you very much.